The organ was still playing when Danny let go of her hands. Molly felt it before she understood it, that small withdrawal, his fingers sliding out of hers like something greased. She kept smiling half a second longer, the way you do when your brain refuses the evidence of your own eyes. The priest had just asked Danny to repeat after him. I, Daniel, take you, Molly. Simple words. Words he'd practiced. And instead of saying them, Danny Cole turned his head toward the back of Street Bridges, toward the woman in the emerald dress who'd slipped into the last pew 10 minutes earlier, and something in his face came loose. Danny, she whispered. Danny, what are you? I can't, he said. Not to her. To the room. To the 200 people packed into the pews. To her mother in the front row. To the God supposedly presiding over all of it. I'm sorry. I can't do this. And then he stepped down off the altar. Later, Molly would try to reconstruct the exact order of things and never quite could. The gasp that moved through the church like a wave. The sound her bouquet made hitting the marble she didn't remember dropping it. The way Danny walked, not ran, walked down the aisle toward the Emerald Woman, who rose to meet him with a smile rehearsed in some mirror Molly would never see. The woman from Danny's office. The one he'd sworn was just a co-worker. Babe, you're being crazy. She remembered her own voice, small and useless. You're leaving me here? Danny didn't turn around. That was the part that would live in her for years, not the leaving, but the not turning around. He took the Emerald Woman's hand and pushed through the heavy oak doors, and the October light spilled in behind them, and then the doors swung shut, and Molly Brennan was standing alone at the altar, in a dress that had cost 4 months of a preschool teacher's salary, in front of everyone she had ever loved. Nobody moved. 200 people, and not one of them knew what a person was supposed to do with this. Her mother had a hand pressed to her mouth. Her sister was halfway out of her seat, and Molly stood there, frozen, feeling the heat climb her neck, feeling herself becoming, in real time, the story these people would tell for the rest of their lives. Remember Molly's wedding? God, wasn't that awful? Well, you know, Danny always could have done better. That was the thought that broke her. Not he left, but they all think he traded up. She felt the first tear come, and hated it. Hated that her body would betray her like this in front of witnesses. And she was reaching blindly for the edge of the altar to steady herself when a chair scraped somewhere in the middle of the church. One man stood up. He was tall, that was the first thing. The way he seemed to unfold out of the pew, unhurried. Charcoal suit, no tie, collar open at the throat, silver just beginning at the temples of dark hair. He didn't look shocked like everyone else. He didn't look sympathetic. He looked, if anything, interrupted like a man who had come to watch one thing happen and was now watching something else, and hadn't decided yet whether he minded. He stepped into the aisle, and he began to walk toward her. Molly didn't know him. She was certain of that she'd have remembered a face like that, all clean, hard angles and a stillness that didn't belong in a room full of panic. But there was a shift in the church as he passed, a change in air pressure, people leaning away from the aisle without seeming to decide to. Her Uncle Frank, a retired cop, had gone very rigid. Behind her, the priest went quiet. The man reached the foot of the altar and stopped. Up close, his eyes were a gray so dark they were almost black, and they moved over her once, not the way men usually looked at her, cataloging what she wasn't, but the way you read a page you hadn't expected to find in a book. Miss Brennan, he said. His voice was low and even, a voice that had never once in its life needed to be raised. The man who just walked out works for me. She stared at him. I don't. Who are you? Salvatore Greco. He let that sit. Down in the front pews, someone made a small sound. Uncle Frank, she realized later, a sound of pure recognition. Salvatore didn't look away from her. Danny handles paperwork for one of my businesses. He talks a great deal when he thinks powerful men are listening. For 4 months he's talked about you. Something moved behind his eyes, cold as deep water. He talked about you the way a small man talks about anything he doesn't deserve. As a burden. As a thing he'd settled for. Stop. He called you his consolation prize, Salvatore said, in front of other men, more than once. The tears came now for real, hot and humiliating, and she hated him for it, this stranger dragging her private degradation into the open. Why are you telling me this? So, you understand. I'm not about to say it out of pity. He paused. and for the first time something in his composure seemed to catch, as if he were surprising himself. He had not, she would learn, planned to say anything at all. He extended his hand. It was steady. The cuff of his shirt was very white against it. If he doesn't want you, then I do. The church stopped breathing. Molly looked at the hand, then at his face. Her mind was a white roar of shock and shame, and underneath it, absurdly, a single small ember of something she'd be ashamed of later, the wild animal relief of being chosen, out loud, in front of every person who had just watched her be discarded. "You don't even know me," she whispered. "I know more than he ever bothered to. This is insane. You could be anyone. You could be dangerous," he agreed. "I am. I won't insult you by pretending otherwise." The hand stayed where it was. "You don't have to take it. You can walk out of here alone and I'll see you home safe and you'll never hear from me again. But if you take my hand right now, every person in this room watches you leave on the arm of a man who wanted you, and no one, for the rest of your life, gets to tell the story where you were left behind." And God help her. That was the sentence. The one that reached into her chest and closed its fingers around the thing Danny had crushed 20 minutes ago. She was a smart woman. Some clear, cold, sensible part of her knew you do not take the hand of a self-described, dangerous stranger at your own abandoned wedding. That knowing sat in her like a stone. She put her hand in his anyway. His fingers closed around hers, warm, dry, certain, and he drew her down off the altar with a steadiness that made her feel, for the first time in an hour, like she wasn't going to fall. 200 faces turned to follow them. Her mother said her name, once, a question. Molly didn't answer it. She walked down the aisle of street. Bridget's on the arm of Salvatore Greco, still in her wedding dress, past the empty pew where the emerald woman had sat, and out through the oak doors into the cold light. 3 black SUVs idled at the curb. Men in dark suits straightened when Salvatore emerged, their eyes moving over Molly with flat, professional curiosity. One of them opened the rear door of the center car. Molly stopped on the church steps. The wind caught her veil. "I need you to know," she said, and her voice was shaking now, all the shock finally arriving at once, "that I have no idea what I just did." Salvatore looked down at her, and for half a second something almost like honesty moved through that hard face, not gentleness, she'd decide later, but the recognition of one person surprising another. "Neither do I," he said. "Get in the car, Molly. It's cold." The penthouse took up the entire top floor of a building over the Delaware, all glass and dark stone, and a silence so complete she could hear the river far below. Someone had already brought a change of clothes, soft gray, cashmere, folded on the guest bed. It didn't fit. That was the first thing that told her the truth about the world she'd walked into. The sweater was a size too small, the sort of size a man guesses when he's ordering flowers for a woman he's never really looked at, and Molly stood there holding it and felt something in her go hard and clear. She came out in her own clothes, the jeans and blouse she'd changed into under her wedding dress that morning, and found Salvatore at the window with a glass of something amber, the city under him, like something he owned. "Your people bought me clothes," she said. "They got the size wrong." He turned, looked at the sweater in her hand. "I told them to guess." "Why?" "Because I wanted to see whether you'd wear something that didn't fit to be polite." His eyes didn't leave her. "You didn't. Good." It should have annoyed her, being tested. Instead, it did something worse. It made her feel seen, which from this man was more dangerous than any gun in the building. She dropped the sweater on a chair. "I'd like the honest answer to a question," she said. "All of it. Because I just torched my entire life in front of my family for a man I met an hour ago, and I'd like to know what I'm standing in." He gestured her toward a chair. She didn't take it. He didn't push. "Danny handles logistics for one of my import businesses," Salvatore said. "Low level. He processes shipping documents and believes this makes him important. Men like Danny talk when they think powerful men are listening. It's how they audition. For 4 months I have listened to him complain about his fiancée. He set the glass down. He said you cried in bridal shops because none of the dresses were cut for a woman your size, and he said it like it was funny. He said the only reason he was going through with the wedding was that your father left you the house on Passyunk, and he intended to sell it." Molly's stomach dropped. He knew about the house. "He was marrying the deed," Salvatore said flatly. "You were incidental to it. He told a room full of men he'd found someone prettier and was, and I quote, figuring out the exit. So you decided to collect me, like the house he wanted to sell. No, the word came fast and hard, the first crack in his composure. I decided nothing. I went to that church today to watch someone else, the woman in the emerald dress, make a move I've been expecting for weeks. I did not go for you. I did not intend to speak. His jaw tightened. And then I watched a man leave you at an altar, and I found I could not stay in my seat, which has not happened to me in a very long time, and which I have not finished being angry about. The honesty of that, the admission that she was a mistake, a break in his own discipline, landed harder than any flattery could have. She sat down, because her legs had stopped cooperating. What are you, Salvatore? He came and sat across from her, close but not too close, and he did not lie. I run the Greco family, he said. You're a smart woman. Don't make me spell it. The people who work for me fear me, and the people who don't fear me more. I'm telling you this now, plainly, on the first night, so you can never say I hid it. His eyes held hers. You can leave in the morning. I'll set you up somewhere safe, far from anyone, and you'll never see me again, or you stay. And I promise you two things. I will never lie to you, and I will never let anyone make you feel the way you felt on that altar today. That's a very pretty speech, Molly said, and her voice only shook a little, for a man with 3 SUVs full of armed men. The corner of his mouth moved, not a smile, the ghost of one. Both things are true, he said. I've found that's usually the case. She looked at the sweater that didn't fit, at the river, at this dangerous man in his quiet, terrible penthouse. The woman in emerald, she said. You knew she'd be at my wedding. Salvatore was quiet a moment. I suspected. Who is she? That, he said, is the more interesting question, and not one I'll answer tonight, because you've had the worst day of your life, and I don't trade in a person's exhaustion. He rose. The guest room has a lock. Use it if it makes you feel safer. Good night, Molly. She almost let him go. Then, Salvatore, the clothes. Tomorrow, tell your people to just ask me. I can tell them my own size. He stopped in the doorway, and the look he gave her then was the first genuinely uncertain thing she'd seen him do. Yes, he said, I'll ask you myself. She meant to leave in the morning. She really did. But the morning brought a phone buzzing with 41 messages, and Molly made the mistake of reading them. Her mother, frantic. Her sister, furious and then frantic. And then, at 6:14 a.m., a text from Danny. I heard you left with Greco. Molly, what did you do? Do you have any idea who that is? Get away from him now. She stared at it a long time. Get away from him now. From Danny, who had walked out of the church without turning around. Who now, less than a day later, was terrified not for her heart, which she'd never once considered, but of the man she'd left with. Thomas, broad-shouldered, the manners of an undertaker, brought her coffee. She hadn't told anyone how she took it. It was exactly right. When she raised an eyebrow, he said, without expression, I asked the barista what a preschool teacher orders. Educated guess, ma'am. And Molly laughed, startled, the first real sound she'd made in a day, and across the penthouse she saw Salvatore go still at the window, like a man who'd heard something he'd been waiting his whole life for and didn't know what to do with. He found her in the study an hour later, and this time he answered the question. Her name is Vanessa Moretti, he said, and turned a photograph toward her, the emerald woman, younger, different hair, standing beside a hard-faced older man. That's her father, Aldo. He ran the family that controlled the ports before I took them. 11 years ago, he made a move against my father. It didn't go the way he planned. He's been in the ground a long time. Vanessa was 17 when it happened. She disappeared. He paused, waited, and 2 years ago she came back, as Danny's co-worker, then as Danny's mistress. Molly's blood ran cold. Danny doesn't know. Danny thinks he seduced a beautiful woman above his station. What actually happened is that Vanessa selected the single most malleable idiot in my organization, one with access to shipping documents, and made him fall in love with her. He's been feeding her my roots for months and calling it pillow talk. His jaw tightened. She didn't come back for revenge with a gun, Molly. She's far smarter than her father. Her father walked in the front door with men and guns and died in an afternoon. Vanessa has spent 11 years learning the lesson. You don't shoot a man like me. You make everything he trusts turn against him, so that when he finally falls, he does it alone, wondering which of his own people held the knife. He looked at her. She wants me to watch it. That's the part her father never understood. She isn't in a hurry. Molly sat slowly. And yesterday, she pulled Danny out of the church. She needed him fully hers. No wife, no house, no life anchoring him. So she walked into a church and crooked her finger, and he ran. His eyes came to hers, and there was something almost apologetic in them. I went to watch her do it. I did not plan for you. The room was very quiet. So now I'm in it, Molly said. The war. Because I left with you. Because you left with me, he agreed. And because Vanessa was in that church and saw me stand up. She's watched me for 2 years and never once seen me break discipline. Yesterday, she watched me cross a room for a woman I'd never met. His voice was flat, but underneath it she heard something coiled. She spent 11 years looking for the one thing I can't afford to lose. I have spent 11 years making very sure I didn't have one. He held her gaze, and yesterday, in front of her, I stood up. Molly's heart was doing something complicated in her chest. Then let me go. Make me no one to you again. You said you could. Salvatore Greco looked at her for a long moment. I could, he said. That would be the intelligent thing. And then, quietly, like a confession pulled out of him against his will, I find I don't want to, which is exactly the problem, and exactly why you should insist. He looked at her like she was a fuse already lit, and Molly, who had left one man for saying too little and now stood in front of another saying far too much, felt the first true crack open in the wall she'd built the moment she took his hand. Then I guess, she said unsteadily, we'd both better be careful. The days that followed had the suspended quality of a held breath and, to Molly's surprise, they were not peaceful, because she and Salvatore Greco could not agree on a single thing. They disagreed about her mother. Salvatore wanted her moved, quietly, to a house upstate with 2 of his men. Molly refused. You don't get to disappear my mother without telling her why. She buried my father alone. She is not a chess piece, and they fought about it for the better part of an evening, low and hard. Until Salvatore did the thing she was learning he never did with anyone else. He changed his mind. He drove her to her mother's himself, sat at the kitchen table in a charcoal suit worth more than the house, and told a frightened 60-year-old woman the truth, plainly, and let her choose. She chose the men upstate, but she chose it. Molly watched Salvatore watch her mother decide, and understood that she had just taught a Mafia boss something he hadn't known he didn't know. They disagreed about her students. She wanted to go back to work. He told her it was impossible. She told him that a woman who vanishes from 20 children's lives without a word is a woman who's already lost, whatever else she keeps. In the end, they compromised a leave of absence, a story about a family emergency, and a promise she'd write each child a letter, and the compromise cost them both something, and that was how she knew it was real. And in between the fights, she learned him. She learned he woke before dawn and stood at the window with coffee, alone, that he read actual books, dog-eared and annotated, that the men who feared him also, unmistakably, loved him, and that he knew the name of every one of their children, which she'd once thought was strategy and now suspected was something closer to hunger, a man building, out of loyalty, the family he'd never let himself have. She learned the way he looked at her when he thought she couldn't see. When she reached past him for a book and their hands nearly touched, and he pulled back like the contact would burn. When she came out one night with her hair down and he looked at her, and then very deliberately looked away, and she understood with a jolt of heat that the looking away was the most honest thing he'd ever done in front of her. He wanted her, not the way Danny had wanted the house, or Vanessa wanted the roots. He wanted her the way the tide wants the shore helplessly, against all sense. And he was holding it at arm's length with everything he had, because he'd told her the truth. To want her was to have a weakness, and he was a man who could not afford one. Vanessa made sure he remembered that. The reminders came the way she did everything, patiently and aimed at the nerve. A funeral wreath delivered to the penthouse lobby, addressed to Molly, with a card that read, "So sorry for your loss," and no name. A photograph slid under the windshield wiper of one of the SUVs. Molly's mother's new house upstate, the front door, taken from across the road that morning. Nothing touched, nothing harmed. Just, I can see it. I can see all of it. I am not in a hurry. The worst came the night one of Salvatore's oldest men, Bruno, A heavy, quiet man who'd carried Salvatore out of a burning building 20 years before didn't come to a meeting. They found him at his kitchen table, unhurt, weeping, a phone in front of him with a video on it, his granddaughter's school, the crossing guard, the classroom window. Vanessa had gotten to him not with money, but with the one thing money can't answer. "Give me the Camden schedule," she told him, "or I take from you what Greco took from me at 17. And Bruno, who would have died for Salvatore without a second's thought, had sat at his kitchen table all night trying to decide whether he could. He'd chosen Salvatore, but he'd had to choose. And when he confessed it, grey-faced, waiting to be killed for even hesitating, Salvatore had done the thing that told Molly more about him than anything else. He'd put a hand on Bruno's shoulder and said, "You came to me. That's all I'll ever ask of any of you." And then, when Bruno was gone, he'd stood at the window for an hour without moving, and Molly had understood that Vanessa was winning, that she was turning his greatest strength, the loyalty he'd built child by child and name by name, into the exact blade she meant to bury in him. "She's not trying to take your men," Molly said quietly, that night. "She's trying to make you doubt them, so that by the time she moves, you're already alone in your own head." Salvatore turned from the window, looked at her a long moment. "Yes," he said, "that's exactly it. How did you—" "Because it's what a bully does to a room full of 6-year-olds, Molly said. "You don't fight the strong one. You make the quiet ones, afraid to sit next to him. Then he's alone, and you never even raised your voice." She wrapped her arms around herself. "I've spent my whole life watching who's about to be left out. It's the only thing I've ever been good at." Something changed in his face then, not want, this time, but recognition, one specialist looking at another. "That," he said slowly, "is not a small thing. That might be the least small thing anyone has ever said to me." The night it nearly broke open between them, there was a storm over the river. She woke to thunder and found him in the dark living room at the window, lightning splitting the sky over the water. Both of them lit blue-white for half-seconds at a time. "You don't sleep," she said. "Not much. Never have. I keep waiting for the night something comes." He glanced at her. "You should be asleep. I keep thinking about the church, about Danny not turning around." She swallowed. "You know the worst part? For one whole second, before you stood up, I believed him, that I was the consolation prize, that I should be grateful anyone married me at all. I've believed that my whole life, Salvatore, that I should be grateful for scraps, and I hate that a man I've known 3 weeks is the first person to look at me like I'm the whole." She stopped. She'd said too much. Salvatore turned fully toward her then. The lightning caught his face, and there was nothing careful in it now, just a naked, dangerous want that stole the breath from her chest. "You are not," he said, low and rough, "a consolation prize. You are the single most alive thing that has walked into this cold glass box in 11 years, and I have spent every day since that church trying to remember why I'm not allowed to reach for you." He lifted his hands slowly, giving her every chance to step back and touch the side of her face, just his fingertips, just once. And every day the reason gets harder to remember. She stopped breathing. His thumb traced her cheekbone. He was close enough now that she could feel the warmth of him, and she wanted God. She wanted to close the last inch, to take back one single thing on her own terms, to be the one who chose this time, and that was the exact moment Tomas's voice came sharp through the dark. "Boss." Salvatore was a different man in an instant, the tenderness gone like a light switched off, his hand already dropping. "What?" "Danny Cole's in the lobby," says Vanessa sent him with a message. "Says if we don't let him up, the next people who come won't ask." The storm flashed. In the white light, Molly watched Salvatore Greco become, fully, the thing the whole city feared. "Safe room," he said to her. "Now." "No," Molly said. "I left one man for making my choices. I'm coming down." She came down behind him, and that was how she saw Danny Cole for the last time. He looked terrible. 3 weeks had hollowed him out. The confident, complacent man who'd left her at the altar was gone, and in his place was something grey and shaking, a man who'd finally understood the size of the water he was in. His eyes found Molly, and something flooded them that might have been shame. "Molly," he said, "God, you have to listen. You have to get away from him. You left me at the altar, Danny." Her voice was very steady. She was almost proud of it. "You don't get to tell me anything ever again." "She's using me," It burst out of him, cracked and desperate. Vanessa, she used me to get to him, and now she's using me to get to you, and I can't. She made me come deliver this. He was crying now. This man who'd never once cried for her. I was going to sell your house. I was awful to you, I know, but I never wanted this. I never wanted you dead. He looked at Salvatore and flinched. She's got more of your people than you think. She knows about Camden. She knows the shipment on the 12th. She's not robbing you anymore. She's going to have you killed and make it look like your own men. The shot came through the lobby's glass front. Molly didn't understand it as a shot at first, just the enormous crack, the sudden spider webbing of the huge window, Danny's body jerking. And then Salvatore moved faster than she'd ever seen a person move, folding his whole body over hers, driving her down behind the marble reception desk as more glass came apart above them, as Tomas and the others returned fire into the storm-dark street. As the night turned to noise, she was on the floor. Salvatore was over her, around her, one hand cradling the back of her head against the cold marble, his heart going like a hammer. His free hand moved over her. Are you hit? Are you hit? And only when he was sure she was whole did the breath go out of him. Danny, she gasped. Is he? Salvatore's face was very close, lit by muzzle flashes, blood on his collar that wasn't his. He's gone. There was nothing anyone could do. And she understood what the shot had really been. Not an attack, a cleanup. Vanessa had sent Danny to deliver a warning he was too frightened to keep to himself, and then killed him the instant he'd served his purpose, in front of Salvatore, through Salvatore's own glass. Danny had been used all the way to the end, used even in his dying, to prove one thing: I can reach into your lobby whenever I like. The gunfire stopped. The storm poured in through the shattered glass. Molly knelt on the wet marble beside a man she'd once meant to marry, a man who'd humiliated her and been, in the last 3 weeks of his life, nothing but a frightened boy in a current far too strong for him, and she found she couldn't hate him. That was the worst of it. He'd been cruel and small and greedy, and he'd also been disposable to the woman he'd thrown her over for, discarded even more completely than he'd discarded Molly, and she knelt there and grieved him a little, which no one in that world would have understood, and which was exactly the thing that made her different from every person in it. Salvatore drew her up, keeping her behind his body. She looked at his face and saw that the man who'd been so afraid of having one thing he couldn't bear to lose was now unmistakably terrified. She missed, Molly whispered, the shooter. If he'd been half a second slower, or if I'd been standing. He didn't miss, Salvatore said quietly, and something in his voice froze her blood. Danny was dead the moment he walked in. The message wasn't Danny's warning, Molly. The message was that she can put a bullet through my glass while you're standing in it. She knew what you were to me before I admitted it to myself. His hand closed hard around hers. The careful part is over. They moved her that night to a safe house on the coast, a low stone place above a black sea, wind screaming off the water, no glass towers, no city, nothing but distance, and Salvatore's most trusted men, and the sound of waves killing themselves against the rocks below. And in the days before the 12th, Molly watched Salvatore go to war, and this time she did not watch from the outside. Because Danny had said one thing before he died that everyone else had let slide past in the noise and the blood, and Molly, who spent her life noticing who was about to be left out, had not let it slide. She's going to have you killed, and make it look like your own men. That's the whole plan, she said, spreading it out for Salvatore and Tomas and Bruno at the safe house table. It's not the shipment. The shipment's bait. Vanessa doesn't want your product. She wants your people. She wants your men to fire the shot, so that when you die knowing they turned. That's the revenge, not killing you. Making you Aldo, making you a man his own family destroyed. She looked up. Which one of you did she try hardest to turn? Silence. Then Bruno, Gray, said, me. No, Molly said gently. She wanted you to say no. You're the loyal one everybody trusts. If you'd turned, it would have looked like a coup. She wants it to look like an accident of loyalty, like one man panicked, in the dark, in the confusion of a firefight, and shot the wrong target, and it happened to be Salvatore. She turned to Salvatore. The 12th isn't an ambush, it's a stage. She's going to make sure there's shooting in the dark, and chaos. And then in the chaos one of your own guns finds you, And every man in that warehouse spends the rest of his life not sure whether he did it. Her voice was steady. So you can't go in ready to fight her men. You have to go in and take the dark away. Make it so there's no confusion for a stray bullet to hide inside. Make every single man see every other man's face. Salvatore stared at her for a long moment, the preschool teacher, who watched to see who'd be left out, and something moved through his face that she'd never seen on it before. Something that, on a lesser man, she'd have called awe. The floodlights, Thomas said slowly. The warehouse rigs. If we bring our own power in and light the whole floor before she expects it, then there's no dark, Salvatore finished. No confusion, no accident, just faces, just men looking at each other, forced to choose in the light where everyone can see them choose. He looked at Molly. You just took her plan apart in an afternoon. She's had it for 11 years. She built it out of people, Molly said quietly. That's the one thing I know better than she does. People aren't shipping documents. In the dark, they'll do what she wants. In the light, looking at a man whose children they know the names of, she shrugged. And it wasn't a small gesture. They'll remember why they loved you. That's the only weapon you've got that she doesn't. So make them use it where they have to look at it. The Camden warehouse was a cathedral of rusted steel and black water, rain drumming the high broken roof, and Vanessa Moretti walked into it on the night of the 12th expecting a gutted enemy and a floor full of turned men and a convenient, chaotic dark. Instead, the floodlights came up. All of them at once. Salvatore's men had rigged their own rig into the warehouse power an hour before she arrived, and the whole vast floor went white and merciless, and seen, every face lit, every gun visible, no shadow anywhere for a stray bullet to hide inside. Vanessa stood at the center of it in a dark coat, 20 of Salvatore's men around her, some of them the ones she'd spent months turning, and for one instant Molly, watching from the steel catwalk above where Salvatore had, this time, allowed her to be, because she'd earned the right to see it end, saw the plan die in Vanessa's eyes. Because a turned man will fire in the dark, but a turned man standing in white light, looking across the floor at Bruno, who carried the boss out of a fire, looking at the boss himself, who knows his daughter's name and paid for her braces 2 winters ago, looking at 11 other men all watching to see what he'll do, that man's hand does not move. Salvatore walked out onto the floor alone. I know she came to some of you, he said, and he did not raise his voice, and in the white light and the drumming rain it carried anyway. I know what she offered, and I know what she threatened, because she threatened the same thing to me 11 years running the people we can't afford to lose. She's very good at it. It's the only thing she has. He turned slowly, letting every man see his face. Bruno, she went to you first. Tell them what you did. I came to you, Bruno said, thick. I told you. You told me. Salvatore turned again. Every one of you she reached I already know. I've known for days. And I did not come here to punish you, because a man who's afraid for his grandchildren isn't a traitor. He's a father, and I will not do to you what her father would have. His voice dropped, and it reached the far wall. She wanted you to kill me in the dark and spend your lives, not sure you did it. So I turned on the lights. Now look at each other. Look at the men beside you. And decide, where everyone can see you decide, whose family you're standing in. Nobody moved. Rain hammered the roof. And then one at a time, in the white light, slow the men Vanessa had spent 11 years, and every threat she owned turning, lowered their guns and turned them the other way, toward her. Vanessa Moretti looked around the warehouse and understood, at last, that she had lost the way her father lost, not to a bigger gun, but to a thing she'd never been able to counterfeit, and had therefore never respected, and had therefore never learned to fight. She looked up at the catwalk, at Molly, and there was almost admiration in it. You, she said. It was you. He was predictable for 11 years, and then a fat little teacher walked into a church and he learned to think like a person. She laughed, low and ruined. You know he'll get tired of you. Men like him always do. You're the soft thing he grabbed to feel human. When it's over, you'll wish you'd stayed the girl who cried in bridal shops. Molly came to the catwalk rail and looked down at her, this brilliant, patient, ruined woman who'd built her whole life on the belief that people were worth exactly what you could extract from them, and had lost, in the end, to a woman who believed the opposite. You had 11 years, Molly said. You had his roots and his money and his own men and a plan so good it should have worked. And you lost to a preschool teacher because you never once in your life sat in a room full of frightened people and made them feel safe. You only ever made them afraid. She held Vanessa's gaze. That was your father's mistake too. You're exactly like him. You just took longer. She didn't ask what happened to Vanessa after the lights. In Salvatore's world, there were only certain answers, and Molly found, to her own quiet unease, that she could live with, not knowing but that she would never, herself, be the one to look away. Salvatore came up to the catwalk last. Blood on him again, not his, never his. She was learning to tell, and he crossed to her and stood there in the noise of the rain, looking at her like a man who'd walked out of the far side of something and hadn't been sure he would. You did that, he said. Not me. You took her apart with the one thing none of us had. We did it, Molly said, and reached up to touch his jaw, the blood, the exhaustion. Come home, Salvatore. Something broke open in his face at the word, home, like it had never once applied to him before. They were married in the spring, in a small stone church on the coast, with no organ and no 200 witnesses, just her mother, who had come around slowly, and then, all at once, the day Salvatore quietly paid off the debt that had strangled her family for a decade and never mentioned it. Her sister, Bruno, weeping openly and daring anyone to mention it. Tomas in an actual tie that appeared to cause him physical pain, and a handful of hard men who knew, now, exactly what kind of woman had walked into their boss's cold glass box and turned the lights on. There was no aisle for anyone to walk away down, but Molly thought about aisles anyway, standing at the front of that little church in a dress cut exactly for her body, a dress the designer had measured 3 times and wept a little over, because Salvatore had told him precisely what she was worth and dared him to disagree. She thought about the last time she'd stood at an altar, frozen, watching a man's back as he walked toward a thinner woman, believing all the way to her bones that she was the thing you settled for. And she looked at the man beside her now, the most dangerous man in every room, who had crossed a church full of strangers to offer his hand to a woman the world had gotten wrong, and who had then, more slowly and more truly, let her teach him the one thing all his power never could, and she understood that the worst day of her life had been a door, and she'd had the nerve, just once, to walk through it. You're certain, Salvatore murmured, only for her, his hand steady around hers the way it had been from the first. It's not too late. You could still choose someone safer. Molly laughed, that bright, startled sound he'd fallen for across a room a lifetime ago. I already chose, she said, in a church, in front of everyone, when I took a stranger's hand. Best decision I ever made. She squeezed his fingers. Now stop stalling and marry me, Mr. Greco. People are watching. And Salvatore Greco, feared by a city, cold to a world, undone at last by exactly one person on this earth, looked at his wife and did the one thing no one who feared him would ever have believed him capable of. He smiled, all the way, without a shred of danger in it. Yes, he said, they are. Let them. Outside. For once, it wasn't raining. And Molly Brennan, who had once been left behind in front of everyone she loved, and who had turned out to be the most dangerous thing in a room full of dangerous men, because she was the only one who'd ever learned to see people, was never, for the rest of her long and well-guarded life, left behind again. Some doors look like the worst day of your life until you find the nerve to walk through them. Molly walked through hers in a wedding dress, and on the other side she learned the thing the whole world had gotten wrong about her, that being the one who notices, who stays, who sees people that was never weakness. It was the only power that ever mattered. If Molly's story stayed with you, leave a like so it can find someone who's still waiting to be seen. Subscribe if you believe the quiet ones deserve the last word, and share this with someone who's ever been called a consolation prize. Then tell me, if you'd been standing at that altar, humiliated in front of everyone, would you have taken the stranger's hand